Well, today we're going to be beginning a new sermon series, and what we're going to be doing as we go throughout the summer, we're going to be looking at the Ten Commandments. I've preached a lot of sermons over the years, but I've never actually taken the time to do a series specifically on the Ten Commandments, and I want to do that this summer. And we're going to begin today, and actually today we are not going to look at the first one, but what we're going to do today is I want to give us kind of an overview of the Ten Commandments in general. And I'm hoping that in doing so, that it will help you kind of see the big picture. It's easy for us to get caught up in the details, and we'll get into the details, and we'll dig into the weeds starting next week. But I want us to just see the big picture of what God is trying to accomplish with the Ten Commandments. And hopefully that is helpful for you as we go through this series throughout the summer. Now, one thing right off the hand that I want to mention about the Ten Commandments is we find them in two places, okay? And we'll be looking at both of these scriptures as we go throughout the summer. But we see the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, okay? That's where we first get them, where God gives the Ten Commandments to Moses. But we also see them in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and we're actually going to look at that passage today. And Deuteronomy chapter 5 is the second time that we see the Ten Commandments. And what happens is, before they go into the Promised Land, years later, Moses recites the Ten Commandments again. And so what happens is, God gives the Ten Commandments, and then about almost 40 years later, when they're about ready to go into the Promised Land, Moses repeats them. Because what happens, if you might recall, is that there's a period where they're in the wilderness for 40 years, okay? And so what happens is a lot of those ones were kids when they first gave the Ten Commandments. And some had even been born. So what we're going to look at today is kind of this recounting and the beginning of that. And what we're going to look at, too, is what happens. There's some words that I think are very significant and important that we get from God right before the Ten Commandments that we usually overlook. And because we overlook them, we miss important insights. Now, with that said, let's dig in here and read from Deuteronomy chapter 5 today. We're going to look at the first 6 verses here. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. Again, that's Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. Hear this word of the Lord for us today. Moses summoned all Israel and said, "Hear, Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today. Learn them and be sure to follow them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. It was not with our ancestors that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive here today. The Lord spoke to you face to face out of the fire on the mountain. At that time, I stood between the Lord and you to declare to you the word of the Lord, because you were afraid of the fire and did not go up the mountain." And he said, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." Now, as we start this, thinking about the Ten Commandments, I want you to just kind of right off the bat, think of some things that normally come to mind. For many of you, maybe when you start thinking of the Ten Commandments, you immediately start thinking of Charlton Heston, right? And the movie Ten Commandments. For others, a lot of times we just think of a bunch of rules, honestly. And we specifically think of it in a negative sense because we start thinking of all those thou shalt nots, okay? For other people, they might think of it more historically. And you really think about it, the Ten Commandments are getting really at the heart, the fabric of society. I mean, from culture after culture, society after society, for centuries after centuries, country after country, the Ten Commandments have been a very important part. Even you think about it, even in our culture. If you would go to the Supreme Court and start to walk up the steps of the Supreme Court, right in the middle, you see these pictures. What do you see right in the middle? You see Moses and the Ten Commandments. Even if you go further into the Supreme Court, the doors you enter in, Again, you see the Ten Commandments. And when you finally get into the Supreme Court, behind the Supreme Court justices, what do you see? Again, the Ten Commandments. And it's kind of ironic that even in recent years we've seen different court cases that have said that different states can't have the Ten Commandments in their courts. But yet, right in the heart of our court system is right there. So I want you to see that this is an important part of our society. But yet, how well do we actually obey these Ten Commandments? I've heard of some people talk about them really more as the 10 suggestions. And honestly, some people kind of think of it almost that way. But here's the thing. The one thing that I really right off the bat want you to think about when you think of the Ten Commandments, and I think it's something that we miss, and at the heart of the Ten Commandments is that they're a covenant. The Ten Commandments are a covenant between God and us. They were a covenant between God and the Israelites. Now let's explore that word covenant for a moment. What do we mean when we talk about the word covenant? You get that word a lot in the Bible. We see all kinds of different covenants. But one of the ideas that I want you to think about in a simple term, as a starting point, is think about a covenant in the sense of a contract. Okay? A lot of times we have contracts in our world today. We have business contracts. One party agrees to do one thing, and in turn, the other party agrees to do something else. And there is a sense in which that goes along here with this idea of a covenant. It goes along with this idea of the Ten Commandments. But there's more involved in that. Really, a covenant takes it to a next level. It's deeper than that. It's a sacred promise. It's, one of the things when you think about a contract, a lot of times there's really not much relationship. But relationship goes at the heart of this idea of covenant. And also along with that, not just that, but covenant is perpetual. It's ongoing. A lot of times with a contract, you have a specific job that needs to be done for a very short period of time, and once that work is done, the contract is over. But what we see in the Bible is that covenants were to be ongoing. Now, we're going to look at this covenant here, but just to give you an idea of some of the other covenants that you see in the Bible. One, probably the very first one in the Bible that I'm aware of, is the covenant of Noah. You think of the rainbow. And right now, obviously, in the month of June, we've been seeing the rainbow a lot, but not in the way that God had in mind. See, that was supposed to be a sacred covenant between God. Remember that God said that He would no longer flood the earth to wipe out humankind. And God has been faithful to His word. Later on, you see with Abraham, how God promised Abraham that He would make him a father of many nations. But the big covenant that we read about in the Old Testament is this one right here. The law of Moses, the Ten Commandments. Now, what's involved in this covenant? Well, one of the things I want you to see, this is really important. Now, verse 6, which also you get this word in Exodus chapter 20. It says this, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And actually, a lot of times in Judaism, they really have this as the first commandment. And what's going on here? It's kind of like a preamble. You think about, we have a Constitution, right? But there's a preamble of the Constitution, right? It talks about we the people. And in a preamble, you give the purpose, what the document is about. Okay? And that's what's going on here. And in this covenant, what we see here is that God acts first. And what does He do? What does He do? He redeems His people. The very first thing that God does is He redeems His people. He brings them out of Egypt. He rescues them from their bondage and slavery. And notice here that God does this before He ever writes the covenant. He does this before He even gives the people the option of following the covenant. What I want you to see is here this idea of grace. Normally when we think about the Ten Commandments, we think about law. We think about judgment. But what we see here first is an act of grace. God's mercy, God's grace, God redeeming and caring for and delivering his people. We need to understand that God always takes the first step. A lot of times we struggle, and we've talked about this before, about taking that first step. A lot of times when we're in relationships, we don't want to take the first step. We don't want to make that first move. We don't want to be the first one to say, I love you, right? That's awkward when the other person doesn't say, I love you back, right? We don't want to be the first person to say, I'm sorry. But I want you to understand is that God takes the first step. And he wants to enter into this relationship with us. And he makes the effort to save us. And the same thing we get in the second covenant. What did Jesus Christ do? He went to the cross for you and for me. He did that before he knew whether you would accept that grace or not. He makes that offer to us. We have a choice of whether we're going to accept that grace or not, whether we're going to enter into that covenant or not. And so here, that's what we get with the Ten Commandments, is that God acts first by redeeming his people, and then he wants them to enter into this relationship and covenant with him. Now with that said, if God acts first, then we are supposed to respond. What is our response? Our response is simply to be obedient. That's what God is looking for us. He wants obedience from us. And so when we think about the Ten Commandments, we get these rules, right? Commands from God of what he wants us to do, of how he wants us to conduct ourselves, of how he wants us to behave. And at the essence of that is this idea of about obedience, that he wants us to be obedient to him. Now, one of the things with that thought, then, is this idea of love. You get that in the scriptures about this idea that if you love me, that you obey me. And so that gets at the essence of this. Now, one of the thoughts of that is this. One of the things that happened in Old Testament times, in the ancient peoples, they would usually have a king, right? And then they would have the people. And a lot of times there would be a covenant like this, where the king would agree to be the king of the people, and he would fight their battles for them, and in turn, the people would agree to follow the king, that they would give their allegiance to their king. That's going on in this Ten Commandments here, okay? God has already shown that he is the Lord our God. He has already saved and rescued and redeemed his people, and they are to respond. Now, one of the things that I want us to think about today as we go throughout the Ten Commandments is that the Ten Commandments tell us a lot about God. They teach us about his nature, who he is, what he is like. And there are two things in particular that I want you to think about today that we learned right from the very beginning. He tells us that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And part of what I want you to see here is that God is telling us that he is holy. When he tells us that he is the Lord our God, he's telling us that he is special. Okay? That there is no one else like him. That he is awesome. Okay? He is our creator. He is our redeemer, our savior. He is holy. He is perfect. There is no one else like him. And you can't just approach him in any old way that you want. Okay? And with that thought, then, it lends us into why he gives us these Ten Commandments. Because he is holy, we have to be holy. We have to be careful in how we approach him. We have to relate with him in a special way. And that leads into the second thing that I want you to understand about his nature, is that he is relational. Okay? He desires to have a relationship with you and me. That gets at the whole idea of a covenant. Covenant is about relationship. And so he wants to have this relationship with you and with me. And what we get then is these commands. First of all, the first four deal with how we relate with God. Okay? How do we relate with him? He tells us how to do that. How to have a relationship with him. But the next six deal with this idea of how we're He's concerned about not only how we relate with Him, but also how we relate with one another. And so He gives us these commands to teach us how to do that. See, God is a relational God. And that's right at the essence of these Ten Commandments. And with that, then, one of the things I want you to understand then is that these Ten Commandments really are about love, which is not what we would normally think of. We don't usually think of rules having to do with love. But yet, that's at the essence of the Ten Commandments. They teach us how to love God and how to love one another. Those first four deal with God and how we are to love Him. You know, we hear all the time that we're supposed to love God. The question then is, how do you do it? Well, He gives us those first four of those Ten Commandments to show us and to teach us exactly what loving God looks like. So when He starts talking about things that thou shalt have no other gods before me, there's a reason for that. When He starts talking about we won't have any graven images. Why is He telling us that? He wants us to understand how to love Him. When He talks about this idea about honoring His name, keeping the Sabbath, what's the point there? He wants us to understand what it looks like to love Him. Likewise, then when we go into the next 6 commandments, they start dealing with our relationships with one another. When He starts talking about things like honoring our parents, and thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not steal, and so on. He's trying to teach us what it looks like to love one another. Now, I want you to see then the correlation here. So here's the first covenant, the law of Moses, the Ten Commandments. We get this idea about loving God and loving our neighbor. And what do we see then in the New Testament? What did Jesus talk about when He said, what were the 2 greatest commandments? What? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He said that these were the 2 greatest commandments, and that all the law and prophets hang on these. So in other words, we need to see the correlation here. They're really one and the same. Jesus is just giving His stamp of approval on the Ten Commandments, saying, hey, when you make the Ten Commandments, really the essence of it is about loving God and loving one another. Now there's one last thing that I want us to think about today as we think about the Ten Commandments. And what we see here is this idea about a mediator. When you think about the Ten Commandments, you also automatically think about Moses, don't you, right? Because God gives Moses the Ten Commandments. And what you read about here, and He tells us in verse 5, that He stood between the Lord and the people. In other words, He acts as a mediator between God and the people. Okay? God gives Moses the Ten Commandments, right? It comes down from the mountain. And He's supposed to tell the people what God has told Him. And in a similar way, what we're supposed to understand then, in the second covenant, it's all about Jesus. Jesus is the mediator of that second covenant. We read about in the Last Supper, Jesus talks about this idea when we think about communion, right? And He talks about this is the blood of the new covenant. Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant. We read about that in the book of Hebrews. And I would encourage you this summer, take some time to read that book of Hebrews. Because if you'll understand that book, if you'll read that book, it's going to make the Ten Commandments easier for you to understand, because you're going to see how it relates to what we see in Jesus. And in those words, particularly in Hebrews, you also read about this idea about sanctification. It talks about this idea that through the sacrifice of Jesus we were made holy. And it talks about that through His blood that we are sanctified. And He talks about this idea that He will put His law in our hearts and that He will write them on our minds. Because the other part of the equation that we think about the Ten Commandments, we also think about the story of the golden calf, right? Moses is up there on the mountain getting the Ten Commandments. At the same time he's up there, what's going on down on here on earth? They're building this golden calf and breaking the first 2 commandments. Right off the bat, right? Remember the story? Moses gets so upset, he throws the 10 commandments down and breaks them, and he has to go back up begin again. Here was the problem with the first covenant. And the people continually disobeyed. They continually broke the Ten Commandments. Although God gave them the word, the instruction, they were unable to keep the Ten Commandments. And here's what's one of the things that's so special about the second covenant with Jesus. Not only does he pay the sacrifice for our sins on the cross, but by giving us the Holy Spirit, he enables us so that we can actually live a sanctified life and actually live in obedience. That we can actually live a life of love. That we can actually fulfill these Ten Commandments. And so I want us to keep that picture as we start off today. So this morning, I want you to think about the Ten Commandments in a little bit different way. I want you to see them as this idea of entering a covenant. And as we go throughout the summer, I want you to think about entering into a covenant relationship with God. That's really what the Ten Commandments are. They're God offering this opportunity to enter into a relationship with Him. And that is a sacred promise. It's one that we've got to take seriously. That we need to understand that if we want to have a relationship with God, that we've got to do it His way. That He desires to rescue us and to save us. But we have to be obedient. We have to live in love. And so with that in mind, I want us to celebrate communion with you today. And I want you to receive this invitation with that in mind. That He is offering Himself, offering a relationship to you and to me, offering for you to enter into a covenant with Him. And He does that through the life of His Son, Jesus.